Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the fifth meeting of the Wellington Circle Study Working Group. My name is Michaela Niles. I'm the MassDOT project manager for this effort, and I'm joined today by members of our consultant team. I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and thank you to our working group members in attendance, including any elected officials on the call today. Before we launch into the presentation, I would like to open with a few procedures for today's meeting. First, please note that this virtual public meeting is being recorded. The Massachusetts Department of Transportation may choose to retain and distribute the video, still images, audio, and/or chat transcript. And by continuing attendance with this virtual public meeting, you are consenting to participate in a recorded event. All recordings and chat transcripts will be considered a public record. If you are not comfortable being recorded, please turn off your camera, keep your microphone muted, and refrain from chatting in the chat or Q&A boxes. Working group members will have the opportunity to ask questions or share comments during the discussion portion of the agenda. To participate, you may use the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen, or if you're participating by phone, you may dial *9. I will then call your name and you can unmute so that you may share your comment or question. We ask that you please keep your microphone muted unless speaking, and ask that all speakers start by stating their name. And this will benefit everyone, especially those who are participating by phone today. Working group members will be able to share their video. You may keep your video on or off, but the main request is to minimize distractions for others who are viewing the presentation. Members of the public in attendance may submit comments or questions at any time in writing using the Q&A, and meeting staff will address them as time allows towards the end of the presentation. And if you need technical assistance, please contact Zoom technical support at 888-799-9666 or email Sarah from our project team at sstoja@hntb.com. So now moving to today's agenda, we'll have a brief overview of the study process, then we'll review the short, medium, and long-term alternatives and present the alternatives analysis. Then we'll have a discussion, and finally, we'll outline the next steps for the study. As an overview of the study background, this conceptual planning study seeks to evaluate the existing and future multimodal conditions at Wellington Circle. This process includes examining ways to redesign the circle to provide better connectivity and improve mobility within the city of Medford and the surrounding region. And based on the analysis and the feedback received over the course of the study, short, medium, and long-term recommendations will be developed and included in a draft final report that will be released for public comment, then finalized in a final report. So this next slide details the goals and objectives of the study, which were developed at the onset of the process. And these are carried throughout the study and have really helped to guide the alternatives development. The primary goals for this effort are to improve safety and mobility for all transportation modes and users in the Wellington Circle area, improve quality of life for residents, and improve local and regional connectivity. And so now in terms of the study process itself, this chart outlines the study tasks, with each step building upon the previous one. And the step highlighted in orange indicates where we are now. And as I mentioned, today we will be discussing the alternatives analysis. And so now with that, I would like to hand it over to Gary McNaughton of the consultant team to review the study alternatives. Gary?
Thank you, Michaela. So I'm going to update you on where we are with the alternatives, what we've been doing since we last met. We've been developing traffic projections for future year conditions with the various alternatives in place and working with the Regional Planning Agency and CTPS through their regional model, and then analyzing some of those results. Some of that work has led us to refinements of the cross sections, and we've been working in details of access for abutting properties, adding sidewalks, refining lane designation, bike lanes, etc. And then we also developed a transit enhanced alternative based on the at-grade triangle alternative, if you remember that from our previous meetings. And then we've further considered the pedestrian bridge and evaluated that alternative and how we can add that as an option for the at-grade alternatives. Next slide. So the short and medium term alternatives, if you recall these, this was What you see on screen here is the combination of the various short and medium term improvements that we had identified, removing the right turn channelization, relocating the Middlesex Ave connection so that we're opening up that area to the north of the parkway. We prohibited eastbound left turns and relocated those so that they would occur through the U-turn to the south. There are some impacts to this, and some benefits from it. On the pedestrian and bike front, we have some modest improvements for bicycles, but we have some more appreciable improvements for pedestrians with better connections, shorter connections, and some improved paths. But you can see some pretty significant increases in open space. The one negative that really came from this was the degradation of the right turn operations. By eliminating those separated right turns, that limited some flexibility on how we can operate the signals. When we look at this, and you'll see this on all of the alternatives, the cost is at the bottom of the screen. And the costs are all in current day dollars. We haven't gone through the escalation effort. We wanted to keep things as an apples to apples comparison, and the way escalation is occurring right now with inflation was skewing some of those results. So to keep things comparable, we just talk in today's dollars. So when you look at this series of at-grade improvements for the short term, they would run roughly $6.2 million. So as I talked about the right turn operations, we do have a variation of this. If you go to the next slide, that we're calling option B, where we keep the eastbound and westbound right turns. So the westbound would basically remain as it is. The eastbound, we would tighten it up so that it's not quite as high speed of a maneuver. And you'll notice we're actually repurposing one of the through lanes to serve that right turn lane so that we are able to shorten that pedestrian crossing, but keep that right turn separated. It gives us, again, the flexibility on the pedestrian phasing for the signals. So similarly, not major changes for bicycles. We have that east-west connection on the south side of the parkway that we're able to add. We're still getting many of the same benefits from this alternative with increased open space and the like. And again, comparable construction cost to the previous option A at roughly $6.2 million. Next slide. So then as we look at the at-grade alternatives, and these are concepts that we've shown before, and when you look, the one thing to keep in mind with all of these, when you look at the existing circle and coming into the circle on the parkway in particular, you have 5 and 6 lanes on each approach. Coming northbound on Fellsway, you have 6 lanes on that approach. Similarly, southbound, you have a couple of different approaches, all of multiple lanes. And where some of the primary goals for this project were to better accommodate pedestrians and bicycles, when you look at the at-grade alternatives, you'll notice fewer lanes. And that has some consequences for vehicle operations that we'll talk about in the alternatives evaluation process. So if you go to the next slide, we'll see the square concept. And these are named just based on the configuration to the north side of the circle. And again, these are ones that you've seen. We've made some minor tweaks to lane assignments, if you compare them side by side. And this one really is prioritizing that Fellsway connection in the north-south compared to the triangle one, which we'll show in a moment. But the key feature of both of the main at-grade alternatives is that quadrant roadway that connects from Fellsway to the south over to Revere Beach Parkway to really best accommodate that heavy and that dominant east of the project to south and south back to the east. So really accommodating that heavy flow through that quadrant roadway. This does change the connections to the north. So you see Middlesex has its own separate move, but obviously the connection from Fellsway to go west requires traveling along that connector road over to Middlesex Ave and vice versa. To go from Middlesex Ave to continue on to the Fellsway southbound, you would have to use that connector road to get over to the roadway on the west. The triangle changes that priority. If you go to the next slide, and you'll see we have the triangle to the north, but you'll notice the Fellsway is oriented to connect primarily to Revere Beach Parkway. And if you're going southbound on Fellsway, you would have to take a right to get onto that roadway that connects to Fellsway. This one, does a little bit better job for vehicles, I think, and this is the one that we modeled for transit, which I'll show in a moment. And both of them do a very good job of creating additional open space, providing opportunities for pedestrians and bicycles. As you'll see, all of the separated facilities that we have there, the bicycle facilities shown in the blue and the pedestrian facilities in the tan. So both of them are comparable on those levels. And again, we'll talk about that more in the analysis slides. Next slide. And this is the transit alternative. So it really is the triangle which we chose as our transit priority alternative because the transit routes are running up Fells Way. This one best served that destination. This one does widen out the roadway a little bit more, adding that lane for the transit service. And I apologize, I didn't highlight the costs, although they are on both sides. The other two were 36 million roughly. And then this one, due to the increased pavement width for the transit alternative, the cost increases slightly to about 38 million overall construction, again, in today's dollars. So you'll see this one really is oriented towards accommodating that transit route from Wellington Station up to the Fells Way and off into that direction where the routes are currently running. Next slide. So we did hear a lot about the at-grade alternatives and the absence of the crossing on the east side of the circle area on the parkway, and the request for a grade separated crossing there. And we did have this alternative that we had shown before. We've gone and priced it out. It is a long span, so there's a lot to cross, so that contributes to the cost, as well as the ramps that are necessary to get up to the elevated structure adds quite a bit to the cost. So when you look at the at-grade alternatives that were roughly in the $36 million range, this pedestrian bridge itself is almost equivalent to those, coming in at about 35.7 million. And again, this is on the east side of the project, the primary circle area. Next slide. And then the other alternative that we advanced into the analysis phase was the grade separated alternative. And as we had discussed, the grade separation is for the east-west roadway. That's really the one that was most feasible. But you know, the drawback to that is it's not really directly serving that south to east, east to south movement that's dominant through the circle. It does provide some benefits for traffic, removing that east-west flow from the surface roadways. But you'll notice the surface roadways are really dictated by the structure and the location of that structure. So you don't have quite as clean and cohesive of a surface roadway network as you might otherwise have hoped. And we are still really need to serve that movement to and from the east to the south, so that we're able to, that's really requiring those double lane roadways coming through and connecting around in that curving pattern to and from those major roadways. The cost of this one, obviously considerably more. And again, these are purely construction dollars, not life cycle costs, which the ongoing maintenance of the structure would further increase the cost. But this one comes in at almost $177 million for the construction, as you've seen on the roadway on the screen here. And if you go to the next slide, what we see is one of the other impacts of the grade separated structure is really the visual impacts. And this is the area where we've opened it up directly under the structure on those surface roadways. Beyond this view, you would have walls that would be further obstructions as you get away from the primary intersections. But even with this, you do start to see some of that visual impact. And the experience for pedestrians and bicyclists would be altered by traveling under that bridge if you're crossing in the north-south direction. If you go to the next slide. So when we talk about the alternatives evaluation, I'll be turning over to others to present this in a moment, but we really started with the 4 primary study goals, and those are informed by a series of different criteria and objectives that we have. And those are the different evaluations that you'll see. On a rating scale, we tried to keep it fairly simple without getting into a lot of nuanced debate over, whether this should be on a scale of 1 to 10. Is it a 2? Is it a 3? Or even 1 to 5? Is it a 2? You end up using 2.5 and things like that. So we just very simple. Is this particular area benefited? Is it neutral, or is it impacted by the different alternatives? So you'll see that evaluation criteria used throughout. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jordan to start talking about some of the safety elements of the evaluation.
Thanks, Gary. Jordan Van Emmerich, part of the project team. I'll briefly be discussing how the various alternatives stack up regarding roadway safety. Way back in the study process, when we were going through existing conditions, we outlined how the complex geometry, the sheer number of travel lanes, and the high vehicle speeds have made Wellington Circle a high crash location with a particular high number of sideswipe and angle collisions. So we'll keep that in mind as we go through these next couple of slides. In the previous working group meeting, we outlined several design elements that aim to improve multimodal and vehicular safety. These include wider pedestrian facilities, protected crossings, protected bike lanes, and accessible bus stops, among many others. We anticipate all of the long-term alternatives to include numerous safety elements, whereas the short-term and mid-term alternatives that Gary outlined would include some, but not all, of the design, safety design elements. Next slide, please. As I said, we anticipate the long-term alternatives include numerous design elements that aim to improve safety. This slide just outlines some of the biggest changes. So all of the long-term alternatives will include fewer approach lanes for each approach at Wellington Circle, along with elimination of certain vehicular movements that would reduce the number of conflict points between vehicles, pedestrians, and bicyclists, along with a more simplified geometry compared to the existing condition. Next slide, please. Regarding pedestrian bicycle safety, currently there are no bicycle accommodations at Wellington Circle, and signalized pedestrian crossings are there currently. But for the long-term alternatives, we anticipate all of them will include fully separated bicycle facilities, as well as more enhanced pedestrian facilities as well. Some of the alternatives will also include additional signalized crossing locations to better line up with pedestrian desire lines. And then the at-grade alternatives that Gary outlined will, the lane reductions and the elimination of slip lanes as part of these alternatives will reduce the highway-like feel of Wellington Circle, whereas the grade separated alternative will not eliminate this highway-like feel of the study area. Next slide, please. In summary, we expect all of the build alternatives to reduce the number of angle and sideswipe crashes through the simplification of the roadway geometry, the elimination of approach lanes, and the inclusion of safety design elements that I outlined earlier. As I said previously, the short-term and medium-term alternatives will include some, but not all, of the changes that we see in the long-term alternatives. So the safety benefit is a little bit less for those alternatives. And then finally, while the grade separated alternative will remove eastbound and westbound traffic from the circle via that overpass, we anticipate the introduction of the overpass and the associated ramps to the overpass would potentially increase the travel speeds along in the area roadways, along with kind of maintaining that existing highway-like feel of the circle. And Emil Gruber will go into more detail on that in the next couple of slides, or sorry, later in the presentation. So with that, I'll hand things off to Maureen, who will talk about mobility and local connectivity.
Thanks, Jordan. Maureen Schlabach, I'm the traffic engineer on the McMahon team. Yeah, so let's talk about how the traffic operates. And as you'll see on the next slide, we kind of spill all the results right at the beginning. So this is your big picture takeaway of what gets better and what gets worse on a mode by mode basis for each of the alternatives that have been described in this presentation. Ideally, what we'd love to see is to see one row with all green check marks. But in this case, on this project, we're not seeing that. And what that really means is that there's a balancing act here. Gary pointed out the number of lanes in each direction at Wellington Circle. It's a high number of travel lanes, which doesn't go well with the ped and bike amenities. So once we start to balance out features for pedestrians and cyclists, that impacts the operations of the vehicles. And that's what you're seeing basically in this chart. The short term helps the walker a little bit. When we get into our long-term at-grade solutions, they do help the pedestrians and the cyclists, but they do knock down the vehicle operations a bit. And then our grade separated helps the vehicle operations, but actually degrades the pedestrian operations. So we'll dig into this a little deeper as we go through these slides. Next, please. Thanks. And before we get into the actual results of the analysis, it's important to just keep in mind the patterns and the volumes at Wellington Circle. It's not your typical situation. First of all, it's a 5-legged intersection. Our dominant moves are not, eastbound, westbound, or northbound, southbound. Our heaviest movement is between the east and the south, which complicates things. And we have a lot of competing movements, as you can see by these graphics. And even our commuter patterns are not what we typically see, where AM and PM reverse in direction. We're not exactly seeing that at Wellington. So quite a bit more challenging to deal with. And on the next slide, what you'll see is a comparison of the amount of traffic that travels through Wellington Circle compared to other high volume intersections in this area. And I'm sure you'll recognize some of these: Sullivan Square, Santilli Circle, Sweetser Circle. By far, Wellington is carrying a lot more traffic than all of these high volume intersections. So just keep this in mind as we go through the results. Next slide, thanks. So what's happened over time is that the existing circle has been tweaked and changed, and capacity has been added. And it's become this big snarl of traffic, but it actually does process a high volume of traffic as it is. However, it does so with a high crash rate and with low amenities for other modes of traffic. So as we developed alternatives that would simplify the geometry, make it easier to get through the circle, would enhance pedestrian and bicycle experience. In doing that, we were really forced to, at times, reduce the vehicle capacity. So we're going to demonstrate this on for each alternative in terms of level of service. But I want to explain how we use level of service in this project. Because again, our goal was to improve safety and make the area multimodal. It was not to make it so a motorist could travel through this area faster than they can today. So while we use level of service, we really used it as a mechanism to understand how much traffic's getting processed. Can we manage the queues between intersections? And do we have movements that are over capacity? So instead of ranking like we usually would, A through F, we had one category that was level service A through D. Then we dropped to the yellow category, which is level service E, meaning you're reaching capacity. And then we did 3 levels of level service F. So if it's orange, it's saying that it's level service F, we have long delays, but there are no movements over capacity. As we move into red, we're starting to see some of the movements reach over capacity. And then once we get to the dark maroon, we have a number of movements over capacity. So this kind of sets the bar for the traffic operations as we evaluated these alternatives. And what you see here is a comparison of the existing conditions to the short-term improvements. Assume it would be on the ground same year. And you can see we get some improvement with the short-term and a couple spots that actually degrade because of lanes that were taken away. And Gary spoke to that with the channelized right turns that were removed. In the next slide, you'll see a comparison between the existing operations and what we expect to occur by 2040. So naturally, traffic volumes will probably increase and some of the levels of service will degrade. But why this scenario is important is 2040 no build becomes our comparison for all of our build long-term options. So as we move on to the next slide, you'll see we'll compare 2040 no build to the at-grade square alternative. And while we are still seeing areas with long delays and poor levels of service, I think what the big takeaway is when you look at these 2 graphics is the street network is much simplified under the square alternative. It's much easier to understand. It's also, it's been spoken about before that the at-build alternatives are safer and better for peds and bikes. So on the next slide, we'll do the same comparison, but with the at-grade triangle with transit enhancements. And again, we're seeing some locations that are problematic in terms of operations. Next, we'll look at no build compared to the grade separated. And this is the one scenario where we begin to see improvements for vehicle operations. And again, that takes you back to the first slide I spoke to, where that is the one scenario where we can make it better for the motorist, but we make it worse for the heads and bikes. And so on the next slide, you'll see a summary. As we've explained, the short-term alternatives do reduce the capacity for some of the movements. And we spoke about option A with the removing the channelized right turns being a bit of a problem in terms of right turn operations. The long-term at-grade alternatives, overall, they all reduce vehicle capacity. When we get to the grade separated alternative, we see an increase in the capacity, but note that that's for eastbound, westbound traffic. And as we noted before, the heaviest movement through the circle is really south to east flow. Next slide, please. Thanks. So I'm going to turn it over to Emil at this point to run you through the pedestrian and bicycle operations.
Thanks, Maureen. Yeah, my name is Emil Gruber. I'm working with McMahon here with the project team, working along with Jordan and Maureen on the traffic analysis. So I'm going to talk through kind of the other modes besides vehicles, starting out with pedestrians. So one of the sort of metrics we looked at when comparing these alternatives to pedestrians is connectivity. So this is the short-term alternative B. And what we've highlighted with these yellow arrows are sort of crossings that have been improved, whether that's they're shorter, they're signalized, or they're brand new crossings where you can't currently cross Wellington Circle. So as you can see, we do get a good number of them, especially up in the northern side with the short-term alternative. And then flipping to the next slide for some of the build alternatives. So first off the square, you can see lots of new and improved crossings. However, we are missing that one crosswalk on the far east of the circle, which currently exists. That was the area where we identified potentially a pedestrian bridge could go. And if we go to the next slide, we can see the triangle. So very similar to the square, generally improved, but still lacking that eastern crosswalk. And then finally, the last of these, looking at the grade separated alternative, I think this one stands out amongst the other ones because compared to the other alternatives, this tends to have shortened crossings, but also more crossings for people kind of walking through the circle. And then obviously a lot of those crossings are happening underneath a highway overpass, so changes the sort of nature of it as well. So then going on to the next slide, kind of sticking with the theme of pedestrian connectivity. If you guys remember all the way back when we were talking about existing conditions for pedestrians out here, we sort of identified this northwest to southeast corner crossing as sort of our, standard crossing that we're going to use to assess the different pedestrians for these presentations. So looking at that crossing, this chart on the left presents the average number of crossings for the fastest route between the northwest and southeast corners. So you can see the existing condition has the most crossings required. The medium and short term only really eliminates one of them. And then the at-grade alternatives tend to have the least, about half as many crossings required to get between these 2 points. Grade separated a little bit worse than the at-grade options. So then moving on from connectivity, but staying with the same kind of corner to corner route, we had presented the average time it would take to cross, which if you remember was about 5 minutes shown at the bottom for the existing there. With the short-term improvements in place, you save about a minute, which is pretty similar to the long-term grade separated. You can see the long-term grade separated actually has more waiting time than the short-term, but a little bit faster because you're able to walk more directly. And then the long-term at grades, this is one area where they really differentiate themselves. They save about a minute and a half over the 5 minute existing crossing time. So moving on from pedestrians, one more on pedestrians. Talking big picture more about the pedestrian experience. So one kind of metric we tried to use to capture that would be looking at the number of crossings of more than 3 lanes where there isn't a refuge island. So you can see, and this is for the entire kind of circle intersection system. Under the existing condition, there are 8 of those. Under our long-term alternatives, you can see the transit enhancement does add some of these longer crossings compared to the at-grade square. And in general, all of the alternatives provide more of these short and safer crossings than the existing does. And then continuing with pedestrian experience, kind of more just talking big picture as we go to the next slide. Kind of stepping back to what Jordan was saying, think about what's out there on Wellington Circle right now. Very wide approaches in terms of travel lanes, lots of kind of large highway style wayfinding signage, very much vehicle scaled. And I think one of the things we think we can benefit at Wellington with basically all of our alternatives is kind of improving that pedestrian scale a little bit and bringing things down to create sort of less of a highway environment, with the obvious exception of the long-term grade separated. Hard to get away from the highway feel when you have an overpass over the top of it. So definitely a major differentiator between the grade separated and the other alternatives we're looking at. So now I believe we are moving on from pedestrians to bicycles. So if you remember, we had presented this a while ago. You kind of look at the bicycle network in the Wellington, the broader region, and there's a big gap in the middle of it. And that's basically where Wellington Circle is. So with the short-term, medium-term alternative, if you remember, we have that little eastbound separated bike lane that we're able to add in. So that, marginal improvement there for that specific connection. But then when we go to the long-term alternatives, I think this is really where basically all of the long-term alternatives show a major benefit for bicyclists. We're able to provide with any of these long-term alternatives, more or less, separated bicycle lanes with signalized crossings really throughout the circle, and potentially try to connect some of those, connect that gap that Wellington Circle currently forms in the regional network. And then I think our next slide kind of tries to quantify this sort of concept. So this is the number of approaches for each concept to the Wellington Circle that we think would have the geometric space for us to provide high comfort, separated bicycle facilities, safe crossings, et cetera. So you can see under the existing, there's really nothing out there. You're riding on the sidewalk, or you're riding basically in the travel lane, or a pretty narrow shoulder. Short and medium term, like I said, gets a little bit. You get that one eastbound separated lane. Looking at the long-term options, this is where we're able to really provide quite a lot. So for our long-term at-grade options, we believe that we could provide high-quality bicycle facilities basically throughout the entire concept and on all the approaches. That grade separated concept also takes a little bit of a hit here, because out on the east side of the circle, where you have that bridge plus the needed travel lanes for the surface roadways, you really kind of don't have space for the separated lanes over there. So that's sort of an overview of the bicycle connections. And I think now we are moving on to transit. So as Maureen discussed, most of these long-term options that we've looked at do have some decrease in vehicle capacity. And we have that decrease in vehicle capacity that does also affect the bus routes going through Wellington Circle. Obviously, improving the bicycle and pedestrian connections through the circle does improve connections to Wellington Station. So in that sense, transit does benefit from all the long-term alternatives, but for this, we're really focusing on those 3 bus routes that come through Wellington Circle from the north over to the east and vice versa. So this chart shows travel time savings. So those negative numbers for the long-term at grade and the long-term grade separated actually reflect slight increases in transit travel time for those bus routes through the circle. So you can see it adds about 20 to 30 seconds with the long-term options. However, this is where the benefit of that transit enhancement comes out. You can see not only does it eliminate the additional travel time for the long-term options, but it actually significantly reduces the travel time through the circle, basically letting those buses bypass most of the queues, particularly in that southbound kind of inbound towards Wellington Station direction. Next slide, please. And then this slide kind of shows the same thing, basically shows the quality of service for each direction for these bus routes under each alternative. And as you can see in general, long-term at grade, long-term grade separated tend to be the same or a little bit worse than existing. Long-term transit the transit enhanced triangle tends to be a little bit better than existing conditions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joanne, who is going to tell us about some of the other metrics we use to assess these alternatives. Thank you.
Okay, so in addition to the transportation effects of the alternatives, we also looked at things that affect quality of life. Those include things like environmental, does it meet the land use, public health, environmental justice, and such. So from the environmental viewpoint, we really don't have a lot of potential impacts associated with our alternatives because we're staying within the existing right-of-way for the most part. The long-term grade separated, though, does have some negative impacts because the bridge for the overpass will require approach ramps and slopes, and those will require some fill in the floodplains, which will affect the potential for floodplain, the 500-year floodplain in this case, and then keep looking to the future for climate change and resiliency that could have potential negative impact there. And while that alternative also does open up some green space, the highway nature, as we've discussed, has a negative impact on sort of the recreational or open space aspects of it. Whereas both the short-term and the medium and the long-term at-grade open up significant areas of open space and green space in this area, and therefore helping also with the climate change and resiliency. The one issue we need to be aware of is that all of the parkways here are on the National Register of Historic Places because they were originally developed as part of the Metropolitan Park System. So while we see benefits with the additional open space for the short and medium term and long term at grade, there will, if this goes forward, there will need to be additional coordination on those issues with regard to the historic nature of the parkway. The next slide, please. Another issue we looked at is looking at land use and economic development. We know Medford has recently undergone a new master planning process and has looking at more potential for mixed use, more walkable types of neighborhoods. And so as discussed, all of the alternatives really, except for the long-term grade separated, do provide benefit in that regard. And knowing that there are multiple businesses right around Wellington Circle, we made sure that all of the alternatives maintain access to the existing driveways. So it would be neutral with regard to that issue. Next slide, please. And one other issue we looked at is a what-if scenario. We know, as similar to Medford, many of the other communities, Everett, Malden, Somerville, all have plans for more intense reuse and redevelopment of properties that might be industrial or highway commercial types of properties now. And so we looked at what would that mean in terms of travel demand. So obviously increasing the number of jobs and people living in this area will increase travel demand. And knowing what we know about the roadways in this area, the urban nature, there's really not many opportunities for increasing vehicular traffic. So therefore, all these options any of these types of development will need to really focus in on increasing travel via alternative modes. And then I'm going to turn this over to Natalie Rayfall to talk about some of the other quality of life issues we have.
Yep. So we looked at public health indicators as part of our quality of life analysis, and that includes 3 factors listed here. So the first is air quality. And you'll see for the alternatives analyzed, there are positive impacts to air quality, and that's largely due to improvements with vehicle efficiency, using standard assumptions for federal policies that will reduce VMT and increase the vehicle efficiency. So that's why we're seeing positive air quality results there. Regarding active transportation facilities and connectivity, if you remember back to what Emil was discussing with bicycle improvements for connectivity and then pedestrian improvements for connectivity and safety for both of them, each alternative has some level of benefit for both of those active transportation modes. And then same with safety, as Jordan discussed earlier, there are expected improvements to safety for all modes with each alternative. And then we looked at community cohesion, which looks at the barriers or lack of barriers between different neighborhoods surrounding Wellington Circle. And so you'll see for the short-term alternative and then the at-grade long-term alternatives, those are expected to reduce barriers for people between neighborhoods because of that improved connectivity for all modes from one end of the circle to the other. However, with the grade separated alternative, although there would be improved bicycle and pedestrian connectivity on the surface roads, the overpass creates a visual barrier between neighborhoods. And so as we've seen from other examples in the area, including McGrath Highway pictured here, that really can serve as a barrier between neighborhoods. And so that would have an overall neutral impact due to the connectivity under the overpass, but then the overpass being that barrier. And lastly, we looked at the impact on environmental justice populations. This map was shown as part of our existing conditions analysis, just showing that there are environmental justice populations surrounding Wellington Circle, mainly those in the minority population. And then there's also vehicle-less households surrounding the circle. And so the analysis found that there are no disproportionate negative impacts to environmental justice populations as compared to the general population at large. And the alternatives would be expected to benefit environmental justice populations and car-free households by improving multimodal connections that we've been discussing. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Gary to summarize our analysis.
Thanks, Natalie. So as you can see overall, the alternatives are giving us quite a few good grades and good green check marks in many of the categories. The one area that we're seeing for whether it's the short term or the longer term at grade alternatives is that vehicle operations are not faring as well. And that was really based on a lot of the goals and the metrics that we established earlier in this process. And we do have a more efficient roadway system. The configuration is more efficient than the existing circle. But as we've noted, we removed a good number of lanes, and those were primarily to make this a better, more livable area for pedestrians, for bicyclists. And that's where we're seeing a lot of those green check marks. We're creating additional open space. We're creating additional opportunities for healthy transportation and really just the overall cohesion of the area. I know when we look at land use and economic development, we're opening up opportunities for space. We do, as those developments occur, there is really going to be an impetus to make sure that those are multimodal. The traditional, increasing vehicles and adding more vehicles to the streets, really isn't something that the network can absorb, whether you're looking at the Wellington Circle area or even beyond as you go further south on Fellsway or along the Parkway. You're going to encounter other areas where the capacity isn't there. So I think both locally and regionally, the importance of, shifting modes and getting people to think differently about their transportation is really going to be, important as those projects occur and as, other projects outside of our study area occur, so that, the roadway, the overall transportation system serves everybody better. And that's really what the goals were for this project. And we think that the alternatives that were developed do accomplish a number of those goals, albeit, with slightly less efficient overall transportation for vehicles individually. And with that, I think we'll open it up to discussion. Michaela wants to come on and moderate that portion.
Yes, thanks, Gary. So as Gary mentioned, at this point, I'd like to open it up to members of the working group for discussion. Please use the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen, and I can identify you to share any comments or questions that you have. I see a raised hand from Todd.
Hi, thank you. I just had a quick note about transit. The MBTA Board of Directors just approved the bus network redesign, but it's still going through some other analysis. And with that change, one of the three routes would come through east-west instead of the same corridor. Although there is an alternate path where it could remain on the leg that you're mentioning, which if we went the transit option route, it would argue to realign that one bus route that was, to be in line with the other two again. potentially. So just wanted to point that out. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you. I next see a raised hand from Emily.
Hi, thanks. I'm somewhat standing in for Jared Powell, who's home with the baby right now. So I'm not quite as up to speed as he is, but I just had a couple of comments, and then I also have a couple sent to me by Jared. One thing is in terms of thinking about vehicular traffic volume compared to bike and pedestrian access. This is predictable because I'm representing the Medford Bicycle Advisory Commission here. But I think it is very worth noting that bicycle traffic is something that really does have room to grow, and that by making places like this less of a barrier to safe use by bicyclists, it's possible to eventually hopefully reduce some of the vehicular traffic demands. A lot of trips that people make through Wellington Circle are actually really short. I doubt that this is an easy thing to study, but I would guess that even though there are a lot of trips that are, 5 or 10 miles that go through this intersection, there are probably also a lot of trips that are 1 to 3 miles. And under the current conditions, a lot of people going from a business, just on one side of the circle to the other would drive that route. And so that is a potential for greatly reducing vehicular traffic through this spot. And another thing that I think is worth keeping in mind, we're starting to see more and more e-bikes and other kind of minimalist personal transportation options, e-scooters, this sort of thing. And these can put a lot of additional demands on bike facilities, because bike facilities, as often built, are not quite wide enough for safe passing with vehicles of drastically different speeds. And a human-powered bike and an e-bike potentially really are drastically different speeds. So I would hope that there could also be some room for expansion of bicycle facilities as volume on those increases. And again, the increasing number of e-bikes means that it becomes that much more realistic for that many more people to travel on an e-bike or a bicycle instead of in a car. So I think that in terms of the long-term thinking, it really is worth accepting a certain amount of reduction in vehicular traffic flow through a place like this. And especially if the long-term development of the area is going to focus more on other travel modes, because there really, as you said, there is not capacity to add more vehicular space. And this is what Jared has asked me to add. He says, I'm not able to fully pay attention to this meeting, but some things that come to mind and half listening a bit before I have to step away. Asking people to walk under overpasses seems really behind the times. Look at 93 near Assembly, that's a nightmare. Crossing under those ramps is terrifying. Also, why would you design alternatives that still have so many traffic lanes? Those new versions are still 6 lanes of traffic in some places, if I'm reading that right. We need real traffic calming, and perhaps reducing vehicle throughput is a feature, not a bug. Also, it's still just too complicated. The square and triangle options still look like spaghetti. Better maybe, but that's a low bar. How about an actual rotary specifically designed to reduce motor vehicle travel with some really cool Euro style separated bike facilities? This shouldn't just be a highway. Maybe the other cited intersections in the area that have lower rates of motor vehicle travel should be models, rather than viewing Wellington as an exception with lots of cars, as if that couldn't change. They're talking about alternative travel, but if so, then actually cut back the roadways. And I think those are some great points. And I have one other comment to add, and this is maybe a little bit of a granular detail, but regarding what Jared mentioned about it looking like spaghetti. A lot of places like this that design an intersection really to maximize the throughput for a lot of traffic, build bicycle and pedestrian facilities around the edges. but then don't necessarily pay sufficient attention to the details of those to make them intuitive for users who are encountering them only occasionally or for the first time, as opposed to for people who go through there every single day. And some of that is really just signage. And I know that's an extremely granular detail at this point in the process, but that detail does often get lost and get missed. So with all of these pedestrian crossings and additional bike facilities, it's important to look at what would you see if you were approaching this intersection and you know that you want to go off to the left and the facility that you're on veers off to the right and you see no signs and no indication of where else it goes. Sometimes the consequence of the way these things are designed means that they can be very unintuitive to actually use when you're actually looking at what you see when you get there. So those are my comments, and thank you for working on this.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Gary, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the bike ped considerations, and then also to the comment about the rotary, talk a little bit about some of the previous iterations of this process and a little bit about why the kind of standard intersection didn't work for this particular area?
Yeah, and if you recall, or if you were involved earlier on in the concept development, we had a number of concepts, and we tended to show most everything. We looked at various, circular configurations, whether it was a true roundabout or, a series of roundabouts or a larger, circular roadway network. And really with the patterns that happen out here, none of those were able to work. And we had other, continuous flow intersections, really looked at, everything that is out there as a tool for trying to come up with a roadway network that would work. And we kept coming back to the quadrant roadway that provides that connection between the south and the east. And that's really what we ended up focusing on as the alternatives for the at-grade options. And they just, that was a process of elimination that was quite a bit of time earlier on in this study that led us to this conclusion. In terms of the number of travel lanes, we are striking that balance as best we can. And we understand, that fewer lanes can be attractive, particularly if you're walking or biking through the area. But we're trying to make sure that, we are keeping some level of mobility for vehicles. As we've noted, delays will increase coming through here. We've tried to create as efficient a system so that we are able to reduce lanes from what they are. As I talked, you have 5 and 6 lanes on many approaches. We're trying to bring those down to 2 lanes or 3 lanes wherever we can. And that's exactly what we're showing on these at-grade alternatives. Taking them down even further, really does start to create an issue where Wellington Circle would become the largest choke point within the roadway network. So we are just trying to strike that balance when we develop an alternative like this.
I next see a raised hand from Peter.
Hello, once again, thank you for working on all this. Some of my comments are going to, I think, echo some of what Emily said, but since I'm representing Walk Medford, we do overlap a little bit. I'm going to first of all say I'm also new to this process as I was just brought on, but I am of the personal thought that I don't think I think there's a value in looking at the grade separation, but I don't think in 2022 we should be trying to build highway overpasses through dense multi-use neighborhoods. It's just not something that anyone wants unless you're a car trying to go through. And I think that's something that if you were to do, you'd be saddled with that for 50 years, and East Medford and Wellington Circle would be much the worse off for it. As for the at-grade alternatives, as someone who is one of those short vehicle trips that Emily was referring to, I live right off Wellington Circle, and I will oftentimes drive to Fellsway Plaza across the street because I don't feel like taking my life in my hands crossing Wellington Circle. I do think that decreasing decreasing the lanes and making the shorter pedestrian crossings would improve my life. I would walk to the grocery store way more often if I didn't have to like mentally prepare myself to go grocery shopping. But it also is important to make sure that those things tie in. You can have some great bike and pedestrian facilities, but if they fade out into nothing around the corners, that's going to be useless. And also, I'm going to echo, though perhaps not as harshly as some of Jared's comments that Emily read, that it does still look like a major arterial roadway, and that is definitely a concern from a walkability and a livability perspective. Nobody wants to, I mean, I don't want to live next to what is basically a highway interchange right now, and it's still, I don't want to live next to a major arterial intersection either, or at least I don't want to live next to something that sounds and looks like it. And one other thing about the traffic analysis, I think I saw this in the Q&A as well. We know from the policies enacted by places like Boston, Cambridge, and Somerville that there is going to, at some point in the next decade, be a drive to reduce, not plateau, but reduce vehicle miles traveled in those municipalities. Is there any consideration given, perhaps in line with what Emily or Jared through Emily talked about, to being able to study what lane needs may or may not be if travel volumes are reduced as major municipalities in the area have said they're going to do? I mean, obviously I guess you can't assume they're going to do that, but is there any consideration given that those are the municipality's stated priorities? Is there a consideration to what if they actually do what they say they're going to do? And that's all I have. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you. Yes, so Gary or Joanne, do you want to talk a little bit about how this study kind of relates to efforts regionally or statewide related to climate goals?
Sure, I'll talk on a few of the points you made. You know, the walking across the circle and the hopping in your car. You know, we have some team members that live and work in the area too, and that's exactly what they told us at the beginning of the project. I won't walk across here, and that was the goals of trying to make it that you can. You know, I don't have to get in my car for fear of, you know, taking my life in my hands walking across here, and we think we've accomplished that. You know, this is two arterial roadways. You know, that is what we're dealing with. And we haven't designed it to accommodate the future volumes. You know, when we work with the regional planning agency, and CTPS is the technical arm that runs the regional model. They're the ones that are running that and telling us what the future volumes will look like without this project, and then with the alternatives in place. And that's where we're seeing the projections for continued growth. We recognize the goals that are out there, and we, you know, encourage that. I expect that a lot of those will be successful. They're just not baked into the regional model yet until you start to see some of that progress and that decrease. So with that, you know, even with the numbers that we're seeing, whether it's existing or the future growth, these are not designed to accommodate all of those vehicles. You know, as was said at the beginning, this is not something where we're trying to get people through here quicker. We've tried to, you know, minimize the roadway where we can. You know, the growth, the decrease in volume that would need to occur, you know, where most of the approaches, we've got 2 lanes at most serving any particular movement. I think there may be a through movement that has 3 lanes, but most of them are 2 lanes. So if you think about that westbound to southbound left turn, there's 2 lanes. And you would presumably need to eliminate 50% of the vehicles in order to reduce it down to a single lane. You know, same thing in the reciprocal north to east movement. So we feel like we've squeezed it where we can. You know, might you be able to take away an eastbound lane through the middle of the circle if you could get a little bit, you know, a 15 or 20% decrease? Potentially, but we're not seeing areas where we could take out lots of lanes just because we've tended to squeeze them down for each individual movement to the extent that we can. And then, ideally on a regional level, things do continue to decrease. As far as the facilities that we have for bicycles, these do open up quite a bit of space. Those inner areas, whether it's a square or a triangle, give us the flexibility to shift those roadways and provide additional space for bicycles and pedestrians, and connecting into the network. The network to the south that's being expanded will connect well with, and as other networks beyond the project limits are established, we'll have a much more complete network. And really, our goal for this was to eliminate that black hole that is Wellington Circle for bikes and peds. And I think we've accomplished that. I don't know if there was another point that I missed on that.
Yeah, Gary, I can talk a little bit about the climate change and adaptation options here. So if you look at what we have here, as Gary said, this creates much more opportunities to switch to an alternative mode, ped or bike. Also could improve transit. The other issue we have here is the amount of green space that these alternatives create. From a climate adaptation point, it allows you to create stormwater management systems to deal with rainfall or excessive rainfall. It also allows you to plant a lot more trees in this area. So the fact that we're adding this amount of green space to what is essentially a pretty much a paved circle, you can it will provide improvement and be consistent with both regional and local climate change policies.
Thank you. I next see a raised hand from Melissa.
Thanks. And Todd took some of my thunder, but from the MBTA perspective, we do have our bus network redesign plan that was approved by our board of directors last month, contingent on completion of the service equity analysis in this month, December. And as you mentioned, we do have most of the bus service is going up via the Fellsway as shown here, but we do have an east-west connection that's continuing to the other side of Mystic Valley Parkway with our proposed reroute of 134. And that's something that we were excited about because of the possibility of getting a better connection to the Wegmans and to Cambridge District Courts and to other planned new developments in Medford that are a bit farther south from the existing bus services that travel through the area. So kind of thinking of how can we enhance that transit. Though that said, I mean, this is a living document, and it was our network is a living thing, and certainly changes aren't set in stone forever. But thinking about, we drew the network without knowing where all the priority would be, and I'd have to do some thinking about some of the goals that we have had with better connectivity versus any potential time savings if transit priority lanes kind of change the calculus. But so those are our thoughts. If there's anything that can be done to kind of enhance the transit experience on the 16 and to the west of Wellington Circle, and make it a safer place for folks to cross the street and to get a bus stop, say across from the courthouse, perhaps. Those are things that we'd be interested in seeing.
Thank you, Melissa. I next see a raised hand from Todd.
Thank you. Since we have a few new faces on, I just wanted to reiterate some of the comments that traffic in Medford has made in the past. So at various times throughout this process, we've tried to make the comment to consider pedestrian bicycle grade separation, which some take that as devaluing, but we actually take the opposite as valuing. So to look at ped bikes similar to the way we would in the past look at vehicles, because a grade separation for peds bikes, not just over one approach, but potentially over the whole thing, would negate any wait times or conflict points at all, even though it would require a vertical displacement up to get over. It would have those other benefits of no wait time, no conflict time. So just want to reiterate that as a point and a request. I do want to note that outside of the Wellington area, Medford is working on improving a bunch of pedestrian bicycle facilities outside this area whenever we have the opportunity, including along the river. So we hope for people to see those start to come online And those wouldn't be, in our opinion, instead of any improvements at this location, would be in addition to, so they would work well together as one. That's it. Thank you. I just wanted to make that point again about the ped bridge. And we architecturally and visually, we think there's potential opportunity to do something really nice architecturally or even artistic version versus the example pedestrian bridge that was shown. Thanks.
Thanks, Todd. I next see a raised hand from Alicia.
Hi, thank you very much. For those who don't know me, I am the Director of Planning, Development, and Sustainability for the City of Medford. We really appreciate all the efforts that have gone into this, all the work that has gone into this. Have been many of the previous iterations, visionings of this. I have a number of comments. I really did want to wait and hear from some of our community groups first. So thank you guys for talking first. I would like to thank you for looking at pricing, treating realistically a grade separated option. It is helpful to have that next to everything else because people have always said, well, what about? I hate it, frankly. I will say that we really would have loved to be able to do an underpass. We think to have seen that at this level of development, we think that there was potential there for that because that does not ruin the pedestrian and bicycle experience. I can't get past the fact that we're trying to get rid of these grade separated overpasses in a variety of places because of the horrible environment it creates for people walking and bicycling, and they're all over Medford. So I just wanted to put that out there that I think it's really important to have it here, to be able to see it, to understand how that impacts and how that compares. So I really appreciate carrying it through so far. But yeah, and I did want to talk to a couple of things. One is the very start, it kills me. Cars versus bikes is a chicken and an egg problem, right? They won't move to bikes until it's safer, but until it's safer, we can't make it impossible for the cars to get through because people need to move around. They need to get to work. They need to live their lives. And that is very frustrating. And one thing that I'm thinking about all of this, and I wonder if this is in a long-term vision for some of our transportation planners. I am not a transportation planner. I'm a general planner and a climate planner, is that, but car lanes in a far future where there's a much denser use of bicycle could more easily become bicycle lanes than if they didn't exist at all, if we were taking from green space or other places. And that kind of comes into my mind that by having these extra lanes for cars now, we could at some point convert some of them more easily to bicycle lanes. I'm just going to put a pin in that. The other thing that I feel like people have mentioned about is this sort of, we would love to see the vehicle use reduced. It is really hard for parts of Medford to reduce vehicle use. And the other piece that I think that I know is sort of baked into the CTPS modeling that is less obvious to everybody else is increased density throughout the region. Massachusetts financial structure, how our municipalities are funded because of Prop 2.5. Prop 2.5 isn't keeping up with inflation anymore. In order for us to be able to be financially viable municipalities, we have to have new growth, which means increased residential density and increased commercial. And if we don't, we can't afford to maintain the services that we're currently providing. So until, as a state, we change how we are funding and capping our funds and how this works, we have to be anticipating new growth, and a responsible government is looking towards additional density and growth, which means additional vehicles and additional bicycles and pedestrians. And I just sort of wanted to make that clear that we're trying, but these are at war with each other. I really wish there was a silver bullet in all of this. Transportation is the hardest, and I get very frustrated by areas of Medford where there is no silver bullet when we study things really hard. And I feel like we're going to have to work with our experts to come to what is the best solution we can come to without it being perfect for anybody. And just a tiny little side question, because I've gone on way too long, is I look at these green spaces and I know that people will cut through them pedestrian wise walking through, but are they really usable green spaces? I mean, is anybody really going to go have a picnic or go hang out or play Frisbee in an area that is bounded by 4 and 5 lane roads? I'd rather see it green than not green, but I do kind of wonder about that. So thank you.
Thank you. Gary, do you want to speak to that last part as well as some of the work that's been done looking at the underpass concept?
Sure. I guess I'll start with the underpass, and the overpass is an interesting one for me. You had to keep a grade separated alternative through this. I have to stay objective through this, but I will say I was developing the concepts and leading the traffic analysis that led to the Casey overpass going away and working with one of our next commenters in Somerville to get rid of the McCarthy overpass on McGrath Highway. So I understand the benefits of not having overpasses in urban areas, and putting one in here. As we saw, it didn't offer a lot of the benefits that we see with the at grade at a much greater cost, just from a dollar perspective, let alone some of the other impacts. As far as the growth and density, we are seeing a lot of projects in this area, through this effort. The projects that are included were shown on some of the maps, and the other things that we know are going on in the surrounding communities. There is a lot of development, a lot of increased density that's happening, that hopefully, much of that can be accommodated via other modes and not just increased single occupant vehicles. And then the spacing of the open space, we did a lot of this. We were trying to lay out these alternatives. If we could put open space on the outside, that's a better thing when you can put it contiguous to other, areas of open space, predominantly in this location on that southwest quadrant. But we just, with the roadway network, we really didn't have that opportunity. We tried to minimize, that barrier on the east side of the square that connects up to Middlesex Ave. We tried to make that a little less of a highway feel, a narrower roadway, so that can feel a little more connected than the existing open space that is within the median of the Fellsway and others. So we've tried. I agree, having it in the middle of a roadway probably isn't quite as nice as being in the middle of a field somewhere, but we've tried to work it in as best we can. And there's a lot of further development. This process will lead to some recommendations within the report. And if it's these at-grade alternatives that are recommended, there's a lot of design refinement to happen, and bringing in landscape architects and others that you can see some changes that may further enhance the overall concept too.
Thank you. I next see a raised hand from Brad.
Thanks, Michaela. I think Emily might have gotten in the queue before me, and frankly, as a Medford stakeholder, I'd welcome Emily to go first, and then from the Somerville standpoint, I'll follow up.
Sounds good. Emily?
Hi, thanks. I just wanted to add one other comment that I forgot before about the pedestrian bridge. That's not shown in any of the graphics on this slide, which I think is one reason we're kind of forgetting about it. But I think that is likely to be a really critical aspect of this on that eastern side. I would guess that if that bridge does not get built, there will be pedestrians trying to scurry across that eastern approach outside of intersections, and that's going to be a problem. The other thing to think about with regards to that pedestrian bridge is bicyclists are going to want to use it too for the exact same reasons. There are businesses on both of those corners, and there's every reason why somebody might want to go straight from one to the other. And a lot of the pedestrian bridges have these hairpin turns that get to be kind of hazardous if there's heavy bicycle and pedestrian traffic trying to use it at the same time. And a request that people walk their bikes up and over is just not realistic. People don't do it. Some types of bikes and some bicycle riders, that's actually very difficult and very awkward to do. And that is setting aside any concerns about e-bikes and so forth. So I hope that as the pedestrian bridges get planned, those options include enough width and turning radiuses that will allow for bicycle riders to actually use those facilities and stay on their bikes without, coming around the corner and accidentally almost hitting someone. This is a common complaint on the pedestrian bridges over the Charles River paths in the various places. The Arthur Fiedler footbridge is one of those. I wanted to thank Alicia for mentioning the chicken and egg issue with car traffic versus bike traffic. And I think it's also worth pointing out, as we anticipate more growth and more population density, if we continue to expect that every new resident of driving age is going to have continue with a ratio of 1 car per resident, that's strictly not sustainable from a geometric standpoint of where all those people are going to park. And parking is already one of the biggest complaints at every public forum in Medford and surrounding areas. And so I think rather than thinking so much about car-free households and everybody giving up their cars completely, and I do live in a car-free household, but we can also be thinking about car-light households where maybe 2 or 3 adults share 1 car instead of each adult needing their own separate car. And once you have fewer vehicles, that means there's more incentive to make some of the trips without that motor vehicle, even when you still have it for the trips where you really need it. But eliminating these barriers and these points where, oh, well, it's not realistic for me to get rid of the car because I just can't get from here to here safely. That's a really critical part of that. So I think that's another thing to think about. And I don't know if there are good ways of studying the potential, anticipating the needs of how many vehicles there really will be. We can anticipate how many vehicles there are per resident now, but as density of residents gets higher, there just is not space to continue with the same ratio of vehicles to people, because there just isn't any place for them to park for all the time that they're sitting around not being driven. And I think that's another aspect, that if we're running out of parking space already, then there's only so much that vehicle volume can possibly increase. But thank you for all those points that you made, Alicia. Those were really great.
Thank you, Emily. Gary, do you want to talk a little bit about the future conditions and also the pedestrian bridge concept?
Yeah, so the pedestrian bridge concept that we carried is just that, there's not a lot of design or architecture that's gone into it. It is simply a bridge that works, that fits within it. There would be a lot more work to go into developing that concept further, for it to ultimately get to construction. We agree with all of your points, the challenges of getting folks to walk bikes, it really just doesn't happen. So, all of those things would need to be considered. The hairpin turns always come down to real estate and what you can fit. So, how that all gets developed, I think there's a long way to go and a lot of work on that, if that were to advance. As far as, sorry, what was the second point?
Related to some of the future conditions and how
Yeah, so
might be able to that.
Yeah, and the future condition, we're a project, within the larger context. So, we've tried to balance it as best we can by not accommodating future growth. If a project like this, 15 years ago within our industry and for Mass DOT, I guess I'll go back and say it was Mass Highway, so it was a different agency, to say, hey, we're not going to accommodate the vehicles that are there, let alone, accommodate 2% growth per year and make sure that everything's designed to a level of service C for vehicles, was just unheard of. So, we've made a lot of progress, and we've, designed this so that it is not, building for the future for vehicles only, it still has a good deal of capacity for vehicles. We still have to, keep in check what is potentially going to happen. And I think, this project lives within the larger regional context of what is the development going to look like? Are they going to be car light developments that don't accommodate and don't encourage those vehicles? We can't assume that that's all going to happen. We have to kind of work with where we're at in that evolution. But I think you're right. Municipalities need to start to really think about that, and a larger regional planning really need to start to put in measures that get you to those goals and make sure that you are not continuing vehicles, because that impact, drive into Boston from any direction, there is no reserve capacity, so the addition of just continuing to add 1 or 2% more cars every year just isn't sustainable. So we really do need to focus on getting people to other modes and other ways for mobility.
Thank you. I next see raised hands from Brad, then Amanda.
Thanks, Michaela. It's nice to see everybody. I think the last time we saw one another was prior to the orange line shutdown. So I want to use that as a little bit of a framing for a couple of comments, if that's okay. Folks, back in August and September, this region came together, MBTA, DOT, the DCR, municipalities, local residents, abutters, grassroots activists. We all came together to say that it was unacceptable for our transit community to not be able to get where they needed to go on time because they were using emergency shuttle buses that were going to be hung up in some of the worst traffic in the northeast part of this country. And credit to all of you who've got your fingerprints on the emergency bus lanes that we collectively installed in places like Wellington Circle this summer and fall. We learned so much during that period. One of the things that we learned during that period is that road diets and reallocation of right-of-way from general purpose automobile travel to low carbon modes of travel does not automatically equal unacceptable levels of motor vehicle queues and motor vehicle delay. We got through that period safely and appropriately. Let's build on that momentum. I point this out because at previous working group meetings, this working group has asked the project team to investigate dedicated bus lanes as part of the future Wellington Circle alternatives. You folks have responded. Thank you. Credit where credit's due. Really appreciate the alternative that shows us some dedicated bus facilities. And I'm not even remotely surprised that your traffic operations analysis and transit delay analysis show that when you give people riding the bus dedicated space, their travel times are reduced. Take that a step further in your logic. One of the things that we've learned in Somerville with our bus lane projects is that reduction in travel time is directly associated with increases in ridership, displacing trips that would otherwise be taxis, Uber, Lyft, or personal automobiles. I'd really like to see the project team take the next step and investigate a couple of more bus facilities. To build on Melissa DeLay's point a moment ago, the MBTA has approved a conceptual bus network redesign that does realign bus route 134 along Route 16. We see one bus lane to accommodate that east-west movement out of 4 approaches. So that's better than 0, but folks, can't we do even better? That bus needs to run on time for this region and for these neighborhoods to work well. So I'd love to see the project team continue to allocate resources and investigate an option that helps speed up the Route 134, perhaps in the eastbound direction. As we dig deeper into this particular design treatment, another thing I'd encourage us all to think about are the pedestrian safety benefits of road diets and bus lanes, protected bike lanes, et cetera. I've said this before, but I got to say it again because others on this call have already said it. When we have fewer lanes to cross, people walking, people using mobility assistant devices like canes, wheelchairs, strollers, they are reduced to the hazards of speeding traffic for less time, right? A bus lane is a de facto road diet. It is 12 feet less, 11 feet less for a pedestrian to cross. We've seen reductions in the number and severity of pedestrian crashes in our bus lane corridors in Somerville. So I think that we're moving in the right direction. I'm so glad to hear so many working group members articulate a people first approach. So thank you, Todd. Thank you, Emily, Peter, Alicia, others. Lastly, I just got to say, Gary acknowledged the work that Somerville has been doing, our community, our grassroots organizers, our electeds, our staff, to tear down the antiquated Route 28 overpass in our Prospect Hill, East Somerville, and Union Square neighborhoods. If anybody wants to dig deeper into those experiences with us, I'm happy to have a longer conversation offline. But we are working and moving that forward. So I'd strongly encourage everybody to continue scrutinizing with a very skeptical eye the trade-offs associated with grade separation and aerial crossings. We know that they're hostile to people. We know that they're hostile to VMT reduction goals. We know they're hostile to redevelopment objectives, and we know they're hostile to public sector finances, both on construction costs and then ongoing life cycle O&M costs. So thanks for letting me represent the Somerville point of view, but I'm so glad that Medford is really leading this discussion. Cheers.
Thank you, Brad. I next see a raised hand from Amanda.
Thank you. So first of all, Brad, thank you for speaking to everything, but also some of the mobility issues some folks have. Through this meeting and actually a lot of the past couple meetings, a lot has been said about the pedestrian bridges. Concerns for walkers, bikers, etc. But what seems to be kind of left to the side often is folks with mobility issues. So I know that, legally, when we think of like the ramps and everything, they have to be a certain grade to qualify. But I think we can take that a step further as we think through the development. I know, Gary, you said that, we're not really into the development phase yet, which thanks for saying that. But I do think when we think of that, we really should get real people with mobility issues to the table to have some of those conversations. Because just because it's illegally, at a certain grade does not mean it's actually functionable. So just some food for that. Thank you.
Great point.
Thank you, Amanda. I don't see any additional raised hands from the working group at this time. So I think with that, we will transition to opening it up to members of the public in attendance. If you'd like to submit a comment or question in writing, please use the Q&A. And if you would like to share a comment or question verbally, please use the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen or dial *9 if you are participating verbally. And again, this is not the only opportunity to comment. You can also share comments or questions throughout the study process using the comment form on our study website. And so I see a couple of comments in the Q&A from Amy as a +1 to Alicia's comment. Induced demand works for all modes. Building bikeways will assist with having more people bike. And then also a comment about the Francis Appleton Bridge at Charles MGH in Boston being a good example of a well-designed and attractive shared use bridge. So thank you, Amy, for sharing those comments. We appreciate that. And so I think we'll give it a few moments in case other folks have any comments or questions. Please feel free to use your raised hand button, or if you're by phone, can dial *9. I see a raised hand from Amanda.
Yeah, just a quick question. You mentioned the public comment period that's coming up. Can you reiterate when that is? Has that been scheduled yet?
Yes, so once they, so as part of our kind of next steps, the team will go back and develop some draft recommendations and pull together a draft final report for public comment. There will be a 30-day public comment period that hasn't yet been determined, but there will be a 30-day public comment period for review of that final report. And then with the comments and feedback taken from that process, all of that will be incorporated into the final report for the study. So we anticipate that actually being early next year for having those draft deliverables.
And we do have the public meeting coming up as
Yes,
well.
so I think that actually takes us, oh, I see a question from Christian who asks about whether there's any funding currently programmed in the TIP for implementing some of these short or long-term recommendations. So Gary, can you talk a little bit about just some of the next steps related to recommendations, the identification of potential funding sources?
Right. So this study is identifying what can be done. What are some of the viable alternatives? What are the ones that come to be recommended based on the goals and objectives that we've just walked through? So there are certainly benefits from both the at-grade and the at-grade longer term, as well as the short and medium term improvements. So the next steps for those, as Michaela was just talking about, is to wrap up the public process, produce the report, get through the comment period, and that report will include recommendations for implementing these improvements and potential funding sources. And then they have to go through the project development process. They have to be identified as project. The funding has to be worked through on the TIP and with the regional planning authorities to make sure that these projects make sense. They become, and they can get through the design process and ultimately get constructed within the funding constraints that exist out there. So there is a very defined process. These alternatives that we're developing, we don't have survey. We're working off aerial photos and GIS level mapping. So there is quite a bit of concept or design development that would occur. And if you're looking at, the short and medium term, that may be a 2 to 3 year development process. If you start talking about those longer term improvements, that may be a 5 to 7 year development process, depending on how quickly they can move. So there is some time to get these projects done. Brad can talk about how long he's been working on McCarthy Overpass and improving McGrath Boulevard. But there is quite a ways to go on seeing things in the ground after this study. So this is really determining what can be done in laying out that roadmap to get to things being built.
The raised hand from Brad.
Thanks, Michaela. And just for all stakeholders to visualize, the question was about federal highway funds that are administered through a regional body called the Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization. And that is a crucial and key opportunity for all local priorities as well as state agency projects to be advanced. I will note that project selection criteria that MPO has established really do push towards human-centered, low-carbon, equitable mobility. And we do expect our municipal partners, our advocacy partners, to hold all of us accountable to select and prioritize projects that are consistent with those values and those criteria. But the TIP, the Transportation Improvement Program that Christian mentioned, is an annual capital plan document that administers about $100 million of construction funding in a kind of a rolling basis. And even though Wellington Circle is not specifically called out on it right now, that doesn't mean that we can't take other important planning steps. The MPO will be renewing its something called a long-range transportation plan just this year. I sit on that board representing Mayor Ballantyne as well as 20 other inner core cities and towns. And we really work hard to get on the phone with people like Alicia and Todd and Amy and their team, John from Malden and his team, everybody to advance projects that are consistent with community values and all the best practices that we're talking about today. So again, if anybody's interested in digging deeper into those issues, please do reach out. But don't limit yourself to thinking about those opportunities. We've got a federal spending package coming through that sometimes it has project pipelines independent of those MPO funding streams. We also have a Massachusetts Gaming Commission set up through the casino permitting process that has very clear grant programs that Medford, Somerville, and many others have worked through to identify opportunities to fund capital construction projects and mitigate the impacts of the casino's development. And this could be a good candidate there. So there's a few different ways for all of us to begin thinking about implementation pathways while we continue the alternatives analysis, while we continue to advocate for a final report and true engineering and design work. So keep the faith and keep showing up, everybody. This is a great working group. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks,
Thank you,
Brad.
Todd.
To clarify, there is no TIP funding in place at this time. I know that was a question that was popped up there. That is the next step. That's what this process leads to, is recommendations that then start to go into the TIP process. So that's the next step, where it's just premature to be there quite yet.
And so in terms of, speaking of next steps, this slide details our study schedule, including our anticipated working group and public meetings. And so in shifting to the next slide, as Gary mentioned a little bit earlier, the second public information meeting is being held next week to share these findings, and the input received from today's working group meeting, as well as next week's public meeting, will assist in the development of the study's recommendations. And following next week's public meeting, the next working group meeting is anticipated to be held in early 2023 to present the draft recommendations. And so for more information on the study, please visit our study website. And for members of the public in attendance, I encourage you to sign up for study updates on our website if you haven't already. The materials from this meeting, including the recording, will be made available on the study website. And for those who are interested in learning more about the shared use path connection at Route 28 in the Wellington underpass, there's a design public hearing tonight about that project. Please visit the MassDOT website for more information, and I'll also drop that into the chat as well, so people have the link to that if you would like more information or to register for tonight's design public hearing. And so with that, that concludes today's meeting. Thank you all for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.